The Korathan Galactic Empire was like a giant machine that had been crushing planets for 3,000 years. They owned 847 different star systems, and not once had anyone managed to stop them. Their ships were huge, their weapons were deadly, and their soldiers never lost a fight. To them, conquering new worlds was just another day at the office. Admiral Velkan sat in his command chair aboard the flagship, reading the latest intelligence report. The Sol system had caught their attention because of strange energy readings. Coming from the third planet, his scientists told him there was a young civilization there, probably just learning how to build spaceships. Perfect for another easy victory. Velkan was not worried. He had done this hundreds of times before. Most species would see his massive fleet and surrender immediately. The smart ones would negotiate. The stubborn ones would fight for maybe Annie. Hour before realizing they had no chance, then they would surrender too. It was always the same pattern. Meanwhile, on Earth's orbital defense station, Commander Kim Hyun-woo was having the worst day of his life. His screen showed dots representing the approaching alien fleet. Each dot was bigger than Earth's largest battleship. There were dozens of them, and they were getting closer every hour. Kim had been a soldier for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He watched the enemy fleet approach and tried to stay calm. His job was to coordinate Earth's defenses, but honestly, what defenses? Humanity had maybe 30 combat-ready ships scattered across the solar system. The aliens had brought enough firepower to turn planets into dust. The lead alien ship was called the Eternal Dominion, and it was absolutely massive. Kim's sensors showed it was over 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapons that could probably destroy cities with single shots. Behind it came cruisers, destroyers, and fighter carriers in perfect formation. They moved like they had done this dance 1,000 times before. Captain Lee Min-ho was busy sending evacuation orders to the outer colonies. Mars, Europa, Titan, every human settlement beyond Earth needed to get their people to safety. Most civilian ships were already running, carrying families and children away from the coming battle. Lee knew they probably wouldn't make it far enough, but he had to try. Lieutenant Park Ji-eun was trying to organize the human ships into some kind of fighting formation. It was like trying to herd cats. The ships were different sizes, made by different companies, with different weapons and different communication systems. Some were military vessels, others were converted cargo ships with guns welded onto them. A few were literally mining ships whose crews had volunteered to fight. The Korathan scouts had already analyzed human technology and were not impressed. They saw primitive kinetic weapons, basically guns that shot metal bullets really fast. They saw fusion reactors that were barely more advanced than chemical rockets. They saw armor plating that looked like it was made in factories instead of grown in automated bioforges. What the aliens completely missed was something that didn't show up on their sensors. In the command center, Admiral Choi Sung-min was reviewing battle plans he had been working on for years. While the politicians had been hoping for peaceful first contact, Choi had been preparing for war. He knew that any species capable of traveling between stars was probably capable of destroying planets. Choi had studied every military conflict in human history. He had read about David fighting Goliath, about small armies defeating large ones through creativity and determination. He had analyzed guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, and the psychology of fighting against impossible odds. Most importantly, he understood something the aliens didn't. Humans got more dangerous when they were cornered. The Korathans expected another routine conquest. They had their standard procedures, their tested tactics, their overwhelming technological advantage. They had conquered species far more advanced than these primitive humans. This would be over quickly, maybe even before lunch. They had never encountered a species that viewed impossible odds as just another problem to solve. They had never fought an enemy that became more creative under pressure, more determined when facing death, more united when threatened with extinction. The Korathans were about to learn that humans didn't fight wars the same way everyone else did. The stage was set for the Empire's first real surprise in 3,000 years. The alien. Message came through on every radio, television, and communication device in the solar system. The voice was cold and mechanical, translated by their computers into dozens of human languages. The words were simple and terrifying. "Surrender immediately, or we will destroy every human settlement. You have 1 hour to comply." Admiral Choi, Sung-min listened to the ultimatum while standing in Earth's main command center. Around him, officers and technicians waited for his response. Some looked scared, others angry, but all of them were looking at him for leadership. The weight of humanity's future rested on his next words. Choi picked up the communication device and spoke clearly into it. His response was broadcast back to the alien fleet on all frequencies. "Come and take it." 3 simple words that would become legendary in human history. No surrender, no negotiation, no begging for mercy. Just a challenge. The alien commander, Admiral Velkan, actually laughed when he heard the translation. In 3,000 years of conquest, he had heard many different responses to the surrender ultimatum. Some species begged for mercy. Others tried to negotiate. A few attempted to buy time with false promises. But never had anyone simply challenged the Empire to come and fight. Velkan found the human response amusing rather than threatening. These primitive creatures actually thought they could fight the mighty Korathan Empire. It was like watching an ant threaten an elephant. Still, their audacity deserved some kind of response. He decided to make an example of them that would serve as a warning to other stubborn species. Captain Yoon Da-hae was commanding the destroyer Incheon when the call for volunteers went out. The humans had decided to accept the aliens' challenge, with single combat, 1 ship against 1 ship. Yoon knew it was probably suicide, but someone had to go first. She had always been the type to volunteer for the dangerous missions. Yoon was 32 years old and had been in the Navy for 10 years. She had grown up on stories of ancient warriors who faced impossible odds with courage and determination. Her grandmother had told her tales of Korean admirals who defeated much larger enemy fleets through clever tactics and sheer willpower. Those stories had shaped her into the kind of person who would volunteer to fight a giant alien warship with a destroyer that was built to fight other human ships. The Incheon was not humanity's most powerful warship, but it was fast and maneuverable. Yoon's crew of 85 men and women knew they were probably going to die, but none of them asked to be transferred. They trusted their captain, and they believed in fighting for their species' survival. Admiral Velkan selected Captain Zorthak to represent the Empire in single combat. Zorthak commanded the battlecruiser Void Render, a ship that had destroyed entire planetary defense fleets. His vessel was 5 times larger than the human destroyer and armed with weapons that could punch through asteroid belts. This would be over quickly. While the 2 ships prepared to face each other, Lieutenant Commander Nam Woo-jin was coordinating emergency protocols across the human fleet. Nam had been Choi's right-hand officer for years, and he understood that the single combat was just the opening move in a much larger game. While everyone watched the duel, he was positioning the rest of the human forces. Civilian transports were scattering in all directions, carrying refugees away from the battle zone. But Nam made sure some of them weren't quite as helpless as they appeared. Hidden among the fleeing ships were disguised military vessels, waiting for their moment to strike. Captain Oh Se-jin received coded orders to move her cruiser Busan into what looked like a defensive position. To the aliens, it would appear that she was simply protecting the fleeing civilians. What they couldn't detect was that she was actually moving into the perfect flanking position for a surprise attack. The Korathans had built their empire on overwhelming force and technological superiority. Their standard tactic was simple: show up with massive fleets, demand surrender, and crush anyone who refused. It had worked for 3,000 years against hundreds of different species. They had never needed to be creative or flexible because raw power had always been enough. But humans were different. They had spent their entire history fighting against impossible odds and finding ways to win anyway. They had developed tactics like guerrilla warfare, asymmetric combat, and psychological operations. Most importantly, they understood that sometimes the best way to win a war was to make the enemy think you were playing by their rules, while actually playing by completely different rules. The aliens expected a straightforward duel between 2 ships. What they were about to get was their first lesson in human creativity under pressure. The battle began exactly as Admiral Velkan expected. His battlecruiser Void Render moved into position with mechanical precision, weapons charging in perfect sequence. The alien crew had done this countless times before: maintain optimal distance, target the enemy's engines first, then systematically destroy their weapons until surrender became inevitable. It was efficient, predictable, and had never failed. Captain Yoon Da-hee had other plans. Instead of trying to match the alien ship's firepower or attempting some clever defensive maneuver, she did something that made the Corathan tactical computers freeze in confusion. She aimed her destroyer straight at the enemy battlecruiser and pushed the engines to maximum power. The Incheon accelerated directly toward the Void Render like a missile. Every alarm on Yoon's bridge was screaming as her ship took massive damage from the alien weapons. Hull plates were torn away. Entire sections were venting atmosphere, and her crew was being thrown around like toys. Any rational captain would have retreated or tried evasive maneuvers, but Yoon wasn't trying to win a traditional space battle. She was trying to prove a point. As her ship's hull began to crack under the alien bombardment, she gave her final order: "All hands abandon ship. 30 seconds." Her crew had trained for this moment. Emergency pods launched in all directions as the Incheon continued its death charge toward the enemy ship. Yoon stayed at her controls until the last possible second, making sure her destroyer would hit exactly where she wanted it to. With less than a heartbeat to spare, Yoon ejected from her command chair. Her escape pod shot away from the Incheon, just as her ship slammed into the Void Render's main weapon array. The explosion was spectacular, a human destroyer sacrificing itself to cripple a ship 5 times its size. As rescue ships picked up her pod, Yoon transmitted a message on all frequencies: "That's for underestimating us." The alien crew of the HFY Void Render found themselves drifting helplessly, with their primary weapons destroyed and their engines damaged. A ship that had conquered planets was now limping away from a battle with a tiny human destroyer. The single combat was supposed to be over, but the real battle was just beginning. Major Kang Min-seok led a squadron of human fighters in an attack that made no sense to the alien computers. Instead of maintaining safe distances and using long-range weapons, the human pilots dove straight into the debris field created by the destroyed ships. Kang's fighters used the wreckage like a 3-dimensional obstacle course. They would disappear behind chunks of destroyed hull, then emerge at impossible angles to launch surprise attacks. Some pilots actually used the gravity wells of larger debris pieces to slingshot themselves around in curves that should have been impossible for their engines to achieve. The Corathan defense systems couldn't track targets that moved like this. Their weapons were designed to hit ships flying in predictable patterns, not pilots who treated empty space like a playground. One human fighter actually bounced off a piece of debris, spun completely around, and managed to fire missiles while flying backwards. Captain Lee So-young was commanding a transport ship that was supposed to be evacuating civilians when alien fighters damaged her engines and left her drifting helplessly. The Corathans expected her to surrender or wait for rescue. Instead, Lee did something that shocked everyone watching the battle. She turned her crippled transport into a weapon. Using her remaining maneuvering thrusters, Lee aimed her ship at an alien cruiser and began accelerating toward it. Her transport wasn't armed with military weapons, but it was carrying several tons of industrial equipment that would make a very effective bomb. The alien captain tried to destroy Lee's ship before it could reach him, but she had positioned herself perfectly. The transport was too close for the cruiser's main guns to target, and too heavily armored for the point defense weapons to stop quickly. Lee's ship slammed into the alien vessel's engine section and exploded, taking both ships with it. Admiral Velkan watched these engagements from his flagship and felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: confusion. His tactical computers were generating error messages because they couldn't understand what the humans were doing. The battle patterns made no sense according to standard military doctrine. Every other species the Empire had fought followed logical rules. They used their strongest ships first, tried to minimize casualties, and retreated when the situation became hopeless. They fought to preserve their forces and maintain strategic advantages, but humans seemed to fight like they had nothing to lose and everything to prove. They turned damaged ships into weapons, used debris as cover, and treated certain death as just another tactical option. Their pilots flew like they were playing a dangerous game rather than fighting for their lives. The Corothans realized they weren't facing a traditional military force. They were fighting a species that approached warfare like an art form, where creativity mattered more than firepower, and courage was more important than technology. This was something completely new in their 3,000 years of conquest, and they had no idea how to respond to it. The Corothan Empire's greatest advantage had always been their artificial intelligence systems. These computers could calculate thousands of battle scenarios in seconds, predict enemy movements with perfect accuracy, and coordinate fleet actions with mechanical precision. For 3,000 years, these AI systems had never failed to deliver victory. But now the computers were sending error messages that no Corothan engineer had ever seen before. The tactical AIs were reporting impossible things: human ships appearing in locations where they couldn't possibly be, weapons that seemed to work differently than physics should allow, and battle patterns that made no logical sense whatsoever. Admiral Velkan stared at his command screens in growing frustration. His computers kept telling him that human ships were hiding behind asteroids that weren't there, or that their weapons were somehow more powerful than their energy signatures indicated. The AI kept recalculating the battle predictions, but every new calculation seemed to contradict the previous one. The truth was that humans had figured out how to confuse the alien sensors in ways the Corothans never expected. They used simple tricks like towing chunks of metal behind their ships to create false radar signatures, or coating their hulls with materials that absorbed certain types of scans. Nothing high-tech or fancy, just creative applications of basic science that the sophisticated alien computers couldn't understand. Captain Ryu Jaemin was commanding a cargo hauler called the Seoul Express when he decided to try something that would have gotten him court-martialed in peacetime. His ship was designed to carry containers between planets, not fight wars, but Ryu had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Instead of waiting for the aliens to board his ship, Ryu decided to board theirs first. He aimed his cargo hauler directly at the main docking bay of the Imperial flagship Eternal Dominion and accelerated to ramming speed. The alien computers assumed this was another suicide attack and prepared their point defense weapons, but Ryu wasn't planning to destroy his ship. At the last moment, he used his cargo hauler's loading thrusters to slow down just enough to crash into the alien docking bay without completely destroying either vessel. His ship punched through the alien ship's outer hull like a giant metal fist, creating a crude but effective boarding tunnel. Ryu led 30 volunteers through the wreckage and into the alien ship. They called it aggressive negotiations because they planned to negotiate the aliens' surrender at gunpoint. The Corothan crew had never experienced a boarding action where the attackers brought their own ship with them as a battering ram. The human boarding party found themselves in a maze of alien corridors filled with confused enemy soldiers. But Ryu's team had prepared for this too. They had studied the layout of Corothan ships from the wreckage of previous battles and knew exactly where to go. While the aliens were still trying to figure out what had happened, the humans were already fighting their way toward the bridge. Lieutenant Colonel Shin A-Ra was watching all of this chaos from her command ship and somehow making sense of it. Her job was to coordinate the human fleet's actions, but traditional fleet coordination didn't work when every captain was improvising their own tactics in real time. Instead, Shin treated the battle like she was conducting a very violent orchestra. She didn't try to control what each ship was doing, but rather helped them work together in their creative madness. When one captain radioed that he was about to ram an alien cruiser, she made sure another ship was in position to rescue the crew. When a fighter squadron reported they were using asteroid debris as weapons, she guided other units to create more debris for them to use. The Corothans had never seen military coordination like this. Their fleets moved with perfect precision, because every ship followed the same tactical doctrine. But the human fleet moved like a living thing, with each part adapting to support the others in ways that couldn't be programmed or predicted. When Imperial Marines finally managed to board some human vessels, they found something that shocked them even more than the ramming attacks. The human crews had rigged their own ships with explosives and were calmly waiting for the boarding parties to arrive. But instead of looking scared or angry, They were singing, the Korathan translators. Couldn't make sense of the songs. Some seemed to be about ancient battles, others about friendship and courage, and a few appeared to be drinking songs that somehow mentioned fighting aliens. The Marines had boarded ships full of enemies who were treating their own probable deaths as a reason to have a party. One human captain actually offered the boarding party coffee before triggering the explosives that destroyed both crews. Another group of humans spent their final moments teaching the alien Marines the words to something their computers translated as, "We will not go quietly into that good night." Admiral Velkan realized that his empire had encountered something completely outside their experience. They had conquered species that fought out of desperation, others that fought out of hatred, and many that fought simply because they had no choice. But they had never faced an enemy that seemed to genuinely enjoy the challenge of fighting against impossible odds. These humans became more creative under pressure, more determined when facing death, and somehow found reasons to laugh even in the middle of a hopeless battle. They were treating the most serious conflict in their species' history like it was both a matter of life and death and the greatest adventure they had ever experienced. Admiral Velkan had commanded fleets for over 2 centuries, and he had never experienced anything like this battle. His technologically superior ships were being destroyed one by an enemy that should have been crushed in the first hour of fighting. Every tactical manual, every strategic doctrine, every piece of military wisdom accumulated over 3,000 years was proving useless against these impossible humans. The worst part was that the humans refused to accept when they were beaten. Normal species would retreat when their ships were critically damaged, preserving their forces for another day. But human ships kept fighting even when they were falling apart. He watched in horror as a human cruiser with half its hull missing continued to fire weapons that shouldn't have had any power left to operate. Captain Park Min-jung commanded that crippled cruiser, the Gwangju. Her ship had taken direct hits from 3 different alien vessels, her engines were dead, and her crew was down to emergency life support. Any reasonable captain would have surrendered or abandoned ship. Instead, Park ordered her remaining crew to reroute power from literally everything else to keep the weapons firing. When an alien boarding party finally reached her bridge, they found Park calmly sitting in her command chair, manually operating. The last working gun turret with a jury-rigged control system made from spare parts and determination. She looked up at the alien soldiers and said, "Sorry, we're not done yet," before triggering the explosive charges her crew had hidden throughout the ship. Stories like this were happening across the entire battle zone. Human crews were treating certain death not as something to be avoided, but as just another tool in their tactical arsenal. They turned their own destroyed ships into weapons, their escape pods into guided missiles, and their final moments into opportunities to take more enemies with them. But the final humiliation for the Korathan Empire came from an unexpected source. Specialist Kim Tae-ho was a communications engineer aboard the human command ship, and he had been quietly working on a side project during the battle. While everyone else was fighting, Kim had been analyzing the alien communication systems, looking for weaknesses. Kim had always been good with computers and radio systems, but he had never tried to hack alien technology before. It turned out that the Korathans, despite their advanced technology, had made their communication networks too secure for their own good. Their encryption was so complex that they had left back doors for their own technicians to use during maintenance. Working with a team of volunteer hackers who had joined the military just for this battle, Kim managed to break into the Imperial Fleet's command frequencies. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Every Korathan ship suddenly found their communication channels flooded with human music, jokes, and victory messages. The alien commanders tried desperately to regain control of their networks, but the humans had prepared for that too. Every time the Korathans blocked one signal, 10 more would appear. Their sophisticated communication system, designed to coordinate the movements of entire fleets, was now broadcasting what their translators could only render as victory songs, and messages like, "Thanks for the target practice." Admiral Velkan's own command channel was hijacked by a transmission from Captain Bae Soo-jin, whose destroyer had been fighting 3 alien ships at once for the past hour. Bae's ship was obviously dying, with fires visible through holes in the hull. but her voice was cheerful and confident as she delivered what would become the most famous message in human military history. "Hey there, alien friends," Bay transmitted on the Imperial command frequency, her words being automatically translated and broadcast to every Corathan ship in the fleet. "This has been fun, but we're just getting warmed up. When you go home, tell your friends we'll be waiting for them, and next time bring more ships, we're just getting started." The transmission cut off as Bay's ship finally exploded, but her message continued to repeat on every alien frequency thanks to Kim's hacking program. The psychological effect on the Corathan fleet was devastating. They had come to conquer a primitive species, and instead found themselves being mocked by enemies who treated their own deaths as punchlines to jokes. Admiral Velkan looked at his tactical displays and realized that his once mighty fleet was now scattered, damaged, and demoralized. Half his ships were destroyed or crippled, his communications were compromised, and his crew was starting to show signs of panic. In 3,000 years of conquest, the Corathan Empire had never faced a strategic defeat. The decision to retreat was the hardest thing Velkan had ever done, but he knew that staying would only result in the complete destruction of his fleet. He ordered what he carefully termed a strategic withdrawal to Imperial space, though everyone knew it was actually a full retreat from an enemy they couldn't understand or defeat. As the surviving Corathan ships limped away from the Sol system, human salvage crews were already swarming over the battlefield. They collected alien technology, studied the wreckage, and began planning improvements to their own ships. The humans had won their first interstellar war, but they were already treating it as practice for the next one. The humans had proven that sometimes the best technology in the galaxy was no match for creativity, determination, and the absolute refusal to give up, even when common sense said defeat was inevitable.